Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, listener. Ready to jump into a new deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Today, we're taking a trip back to the 1960s in America. A decade that's, well, it's basically known for change, right?
Definitely.
But it's also kind of a paradox when you think about it. You've got this whole peace and love thing going on.
Right.
But also, there were intense protests and, serious social upheaval.
Yeah, it's a decade that's often romanticized.
For sure.
Or vilified, even.
Yeah.
But as always, I think the reality is much more complex.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're going to try to unpack that,
Yeah.
really get into the legacy of the 1960s student movement.
Awesome.
And figure out, what was its impact? Did it actually change anything?
Big questions. And we've got some really interesting sources that I think will help us with this.
Oh, yeah. What do we got?
Well, we've got excerpts from a lecture. It's called Radical or Ruinous.
Ooh, I love that title.
Yeah.
Radical or Ruinous. It
Yeah.
really kind of sets the stage.
It does. Right off the bat, you're thinking, okay, which was it?
Right, exactly.
So we'll be diving into that. And we've also got some thoughts from historians who have, dedicated their careers to understanding this period.
Perfect. I'm ready to get started.
Yeah.
So let's set the scene first. What were the big things that kind of fueled all this student activism in the 60s?
Well, it wasn't just one single thing, It was kind of a perfect storm of social and political forces all happening at the same time.
Right.
But one really big factor, obviously, was the civil rights movement. It was gaining so much momentum at the time, really inspiring a whole generation to fight for equality.
Yeah.
For example, the Freedom Rides in 1961.
Oh, yeah.
Where these activists so bravely challenged segregation on interstate buses, putting themselves on the line.
Yeah, incredibly courageous.
Really a powerful example.
And then, of course, you can't talk about the 60s without mentioning the Vietnam War. And, well, that escalated in 1965 and became this massive focal point for student protests.
Absolutely. And especially among students who were, facing the draft, it's hard to overstate how much opposition there was to that war.
Right.
It became this powerful unifying force for them. And it wasn't just about the war itself, but what it represented. It was like a rejection of militarism, of what many saw as an imperialistic foreign policy. The idea of the U.S. getting involved in these conflicts that, in their minds, weren't our business.
Yeah, I see that. It's interesting how those events, happening outside of the universities, seem to also fuel this fire within them,
Definitely.
Campuses, especially places like, the famous one, UC Berkeley. They became real hotbeds for activism.
Totally. And students weren't just concerned about these big global issues either. They were also challenging the authority figures within their own universities, protesting things like, bureaucratic control, restrictions on what they could say, and the university's ties to the military-industrial complex, which was a big deal at the time.
Right. So they were basically fighting on multiple fronts. They were fighting for social justice on a national scale, and then also for more autonomy and freedom of expression right there on their own campuses.
Exactly. And it all kind of built up to a few key moments that I think really capture the whole spirit of the 1960 student movement. And there are two events specifically that stand out in our sources.
Let me guess. The Berkeley Free Speech Movement in 1964.
You got it.
Yeah, that was a landmark event.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. It was pivotal in the fight for students' right to actually engage in political activity while they were on campus, which seems kind of obvious now, but back then, not so much.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. And who is that really charismatic student leader? I remember reading about him, Mario something.
Mario Savio.
Yeah.
He was a huge part of that. He really spearheaded this whole movement that challenged all these university restrictions on things like organizing and even just, speaking your mind about politics. Right. And then fast forward a few years, and you've got the Columbia University occupations in 1968, which feels like, maybe a boiling point. For the movement,
Yeah, you could definitely say that. Things escalated very quickly at Columbia. Protests against racism and the Vietnam War they got really intense, really fast. Students took over buildings. There were clashes with police. It was a chaotic scene. And it really showed this growing divide between this generation that was demanding change and an establishment that just seemed very resistant to it, like they weren't listening.
Yeah. So we've got this backdrop of huge social and political change, right? We've got these key events that really ignited the movement. And then out of all this comes this very influential force, the New Left. But was it radical or was it Ruinous. I mean, how should we even understand its legacy?
Well, that's where things get really interesting because there are a lot of different opinions on this. And as you might expect, they're pretty divergent. Some people, like Todd Gitlin, who was actually involved in the movement himself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he looks back on the 60s with this sense of idealism.
I could see that.
You know, he sees groups like Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, as they were known, as really embodying this idea of participatory democracy, like a real attempt to actually challenge the power structures of the time.
Yeah. So it sounds like they believed in the power of like grassroots organizing, you know, and direct action to create real change. And from their perspective, I mean, they did achieve some significant victories, right? Like they were influential in the eventual withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam.
Yeah, I think they would definitely argue that. But then you have other historians who, well, they offer a more critical perspective. They argue that while the movement had these really noble goals, it's radicalism, and especially as some factions embraced these more extreme tactics, well, it ended up alienating the public, and ultimately, in their view, it backfired.
That makes sense. I mean, public opinion is so crucial for any movement to actually succeed. It's almost like a delicate dance. You know, pushing for radical change, but at the same time trying to keep that broad base of support.
You got it. And it's important to remember that these debates about the New Left, they're still going on today.
Wow, really?
Yeah, which I think shows just how deeply this era still resonates with us. You know, we're still trying to make sense of it.
It's like it wasn't just some historical blip. It actually had a real lasting impact, which is pretty incredible when you think about it. But like you said earlier, it's super important to not oversimplify this period. It was complex.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So what are some of the nuances that we should be aware of? Things that maybe challenge the typical picture we have of 1960s activism?
Well, one thing that people often overlook is that the student movement wasn't just happening at these elite Ivy League schools.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we tend to focus on places like Berkeley and Columbia. You know, those are the big names that everyone knows. But activism was happening all across the country on campuses that weren't exactly known for being super politically radical.
So it wasn't just like these privileged students driving this change. It was much broader than that.
Exactly. Much broader. And historian Ken Heineman, he points to Kent State University as a really good example of this. Students there were actively involved in anti-war organizing long before the tragic events that, sadly, made the university a symbol of the era's turmoil.
Right, right. It's a good reminder that there were so many diverse voices and experiences within this movement. What else should we kind of keep in mind as we try to, like, paint this more complete picture?
Well, there's also this idea that the 1960s was like this clean break from the past, right? Like suddenly everyone just became radical out of nowhere.
Yeah.
But historian Thomas Shugru, he argues against that. He sees a strong connection between the activism of the 60s and the movements that were already happening in the 50s, especially the civil rights movement.
So it wasn't like activism just magically appeared in 1960. It was building on what came before.
Exactly. Like, you could say that the activists of the 50s planted the seeds that then blossomed into those full-blown movements of the 60s.
That's a great analogy. It's really important to understand those connections.
Definitely.
You know, recognize all the work that had to be done before the 60s to make all of these movements possible. But our sources, they also kind of urge us to look beyond those familiar narratives.
Yeah.
You know, beyond Vietnam, beyond the free speech movement. What else was going on during this decade that maybe deserves more attention?
One really crucial development that I think often gets overlooked is the rise of the women's liberation movement toward the end of the decade.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That feels like where we see the very beginning of what would become the feminist revolution of the 70s.
Exactly. And it's a great example of how the 60s wasn't just about one massive movement, but actually multiple currents of social change all happening at the same time.
It's like this amazing tapestry of activism.
Exactly.
With all these threads interwoven.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so fascinating to study. It wasn't just about one issue or one group, but all of these movements pushing for a more just and equitable society. And actually, that brings us to another really fascinating aspect of the 1960s that I think our sources highlight. The seeds of what would become the conservative resurgence. You know, the one that really came to define American politics in the decades that followed.
Wait, so you're saying that while the 60s are often seen as this, like, era of liberal triumph,
right,
they also laid the groundwork for the right's resurgence.
Exactly.
That's a wild twist. I mean, history is full of unintended consequences, isn't it?
It really is. And while all these activists were pushing for these radical changes, there was also this counter-movement brewing,
Wow.
fueled by all this anxiety about the pace and the direction of social change. And this counter-movement would eventually become what we know as neoconservatism, a very powerful force that would align itself with the Republican Party and, well, reshape American politics for decades to come.
So while the left was rising, so was the right. Just in a different way.
Exactly.
I'm really curious to learn more about how this neoconservative movement actually took shape. Like, where did it come from?
Me too. It's a fascinating story.
Yeah.
And it really highlights those complexities and contradictions of this era.
Well, listener, get ready, because in part 2 of our deep dive, we're going to explore this very topic. The rise of neoconservatism and how it emerged from the, let's just say, exciting landscape of the 1960s. We'll trace its origins, look at some of the key figures, and of course talk about its lasting impact on American society.
Welcome back, listener, to our 1960s deep dive. Last time we were talking about this idea that while the 60s were a time of, huge progress, they also had this kind of hidden conservative backlash brewing under the surface.
Yeah, that's right. It really shows how history is full of these, unintended consequences,
Yeah.
It's not always just a straight line from A to B.
Totally. One thing leads to another, and then, bam, something totally unexpected happens.
Exactly. It's never simple.
Yeah.
So let's dig a little deeper into this idea of a conservative backlash.
Our sources keep mentioning neoconservatism as a key force that emerged from this period. So I guess the first question is, what exactly is neoconservatism?
Yeah, good question. It's one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, but I'm not always sure people really understand what it means.
Right. It's not a super easy thing to, neatly define.
Okay.
But there are definitely some core ideas that run through it.
All right, so give me the rundown. What are some of those core ideas? What makes neoconservatism different from other types of conservatism?
Well, one big thing is this emphasis on traditional values.
Okay.
Neoconservatives back then, they felt like all those rapid social and cultural changes that were happening in the 60s, especially with the counterculture movement,
Right.
they felt like all of that had eroded these traditional values that they saw as really important. Things like family, religion, patriotism.
Yeah.
And they saw that erosion as a threat to social stability, like it was unraveling society.
So they were basically longing for a return to a more ordered society, more predictable, one that was based on this more, traditional morality.
Yeah, you could definitely say that. They felt like this liberal embrace of social change had gone too far, and it was time to kind of reassert those values as the foundation for a healthy society.
It makes sense. I mean, people are going to react in different ways to times of such dramatic change.
Yeah.
Some people embrace it, others push back.
Right, exactly. It's natural.
So traditional values, that's one piece. What else?
Another key element was a strong belief in national defense.
Okay.
And a really assertive foreign policy. Neoconservatives, they were very anti-communist.
Right. The Cold War was in full swing.
Exactly. And they felt like the United States needed to project strength on the world stage. They often criticized what they saw as weakness from the left in the face of that Soviet threat.
So they were more hawkish, for sure. They believed the U.S. had this, moral obligation to combat communism around the world.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They saw the Cold War as this ideological battle, like good versus evil, and they felt that the U.S. really needed to step up and lead the fight.
Interesting. And on the economic front, where did they stand?
Generally, they were all about free market capitalism.
Okay.
And very skeptical of any kind of government intervention in the economy.
Yeah.
They felt like the welfare state, which, had expanded a lot during the 60s.
Right.
They felt like that had created a culture of dependency and had actually stifled economic growth.
So limited government, individual responsibility, policies that encourage economic freedom.
Exactly. They really believed that the free market was the best path to create prosperity and opportunity for everyone, and that more often than not, the government just got in the way.
Okay, so we've got these core ideas, traditional values, strong national defense, free market economics. Got it. But how did all that actually translate into a real political movement? I mean, how did it go from just a set of ideas to something that was actually shaping elections and, policies?
Right. Well, that's where things get even more interesting. The thing is, the political landscape in the 60s, it was in flux.
In what way?
Well, the Democratic Party, which had basically been the dominant force in politics for decades,
Right.
they were starting to fracture. There were all these internal divisions, especially over things like civil rights and the Vietnam War.
Makes sense. Those were such divisive issues.
Exactly. And this fracturing, it created a real opportunity for Republicans. They were able to appeal to a lot of voters who felt like the Democrats had become too radical.
Too out of touch, maybe.
Exactly. Too out of touch with their concerns.
So it's like this neoconservative message. It kind of found fertile ground in this whole environment of political realignment. Like the pieces were shifting, and they were able to capitalize on that.
Right. And Richard Nixon's victory in the 1968 presidential election, that was a big sign of this changing tide.
Nixon, yeah.
And while Nixon himself wasn't really a neoconservative,
Right.
he was definitely good at tapping into those conservative anxieties about social change. He used that to his advantage. Like, remember his whole law and order rhetoric?
Oh, yeah.
That really resonated with a lot of voters who were worried about things like crime and all the unrest that was happening.
Yeah. It's like neoconservatism didn't just come out of nowhere. It was shaped by these very real political opportunities and anxieties. You know, people were looking for answers, looking for someone to address those concerns.
Exactly. And it's a great example of how intellectual movements and the realities of politics, they often go hand in hand.
For sure. Okay, so we've got these seeds of this movement being planted in the late 60s. But when did it really take off? When did it go from this, like, fringe idea to a real force in American politics?
Well, the 70s were a big decade for the rise of neoconservatism. It was a decade full of crises. You know, you had the economic stagflation, the Watergate scandal, the Iran hostage crisis.
Yeah, not exactly a walk in the park.
No, not at all. And all these things, they really shook people's faith in the liberal establishment. Like, okay, what's going on here?
Right, like we need some new answers.
Exactly. And the neoconservatives were ready with their critique.
We had a plan.
Yeah, they were saying things like, look, these Great Society programs, they backfired.
They created dependency instead of actually empowering people.
And look at how American power and prestige has declined on the world stage after Vietnam.
We need to get back on track.
Exactly. They were tapping into this sense of disillusionment and offering up this, like, alternative vision, a vision of a renewed America, one that was grounded in those traditional values, economic freedom, and a strong military.
So they presented themselves as the solution, like, we have the answers that you're looking for.
Right. And this message, it resonated with a lot of people, more and more as the 70s went on. And all of that paved the way for the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980.
Reagan, a turning point.
A huge turning point. Reagan's victory was a watershed moment for neoconservatism. It was like, officially, they had arrived, a dominant force in American politics.
And his presidency was definitely a huge shift away from those liberal policies of the previous decades. I mean, he was all about tax cuts, deregulation, and of course that massive military buildup. All stuff that was like straight out of the neoconservative playbook.
Totally. And while neoconservatism itself, it's definitely evolved and splintered in the decades since Reagan.
Right.
Its core ideas, they still shape a lot of our debates today. Everything from social policy to foreign policy to the role of government.
So even though it came out of the 60s as this like reaction to the big changes happening then, it's really had a lasting impact. I mean, its influence extends way beyond that one decade.
Absolutely. It really shows how historical events and movements can have these ripple effects that just keep going and going for generations.
Crazy. It's mind-blowing how a decade that's so often associated with, liberalism also gave birth to one of the most influential conservative movements in American history.
Yeah, it really speaks to the complexity of the 60s. I mean, we've talked about the student movement, we've talked about the rise of neoconservatism, but are there other ways that historians have looked at the legacy of this era? Because I'm sure there are. Oh, yeah, definitely. There's a whole spectrum of historical interpretations of the 60s out there. Each one offers a slightly different lens through which to view this whole period, and it's important to consider them all.
Well, listener, that sounds like a perfect segue into part 3 of our deep dive. We're going to explore all those different historical interpretations of the 60s. You know, how have historians grappled with the legacy of this decade? And what lessons have they learned from this period of, well, pretty intense change and upheaval? It'll be interesting to see how all the pieces fit together. All right, listener, welcome back to our final deep dive into the 1960s.
Time to wrap things up.
It really is amazing, like how much this one decade still kind of fascinates us.
Yeah. I mean, the 60s were just this massive turning point for America. So much changed, so much upheaval. It's no wonder historians are still trying to figure out what it all meant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as we wrap things up, I really want to get into all those different historical interpretations we were talking about.
Yeah, good idea.
Our sources mentioned a few different schools of thought, so to speak. So where should we start?
Well, one of the big ones is what we might call like the progressive school.
Okay.
These are historians who tend to view the 60s through this lens of, tremendous progress, a time when grassroots activism really pushed America toward a more just and equitable society.
So for them, the 60s represent this moment of hope, possibility, a time when people really believed they could change the world.
Exactly. They often focus on the courage and the idealism of the activists who were, on the front lines fighting against racism, sexism, war, poverty, all the big issues. And they see the legacy of the 60s and all the progress that's been made since then in areas like civil rights, women's rights, environmental protection, all things that were really pushed forward by those movements.
I mean, it's hard to deny the impact those movements had. They really did change the landscape of America.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there are also historians who offer a more, I don't know, maybe critical perspective, who don't necessarily see the 60s as just this straightforward story of triumph and progress.
Oh, yeah, for sure. There are definitely historians who offer a more nuanced and sometimes even critical take. They argue that, while the progressive school has a point,
Right.
they can sometimes over-romanticize the era.
Yeah.
They can overlook some of the excesses or the fact that some of those efforts, even though they were well-intentioned, maybe they had some unintended consequences.
Right.
Not everything that happened in the 60s was good.
Right. It's important to acknowledge that there were definitely some missteps along the way. Not everything worked out the way they hoped.
Exactly. And this brings us to another perspective, which you could call the conservative critique of the 60s.
Yeah.
Historians in this camp, they tend to argue that while the era's radicalism, maybe it was coming from a good place,
Right.
it ultimately undermined some of those traditional values and institutions that, in their view, held society together. And that led to a decline in, social cohesion, that sense of shared values.
So for them, the 60s represent, I don't know, maybe a period of decline.
Yeah.
Where America kind of started to go off track, straying from its core principles.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. They often point to things like the rise in crime rates in the 70s or increased drug use, changes in family structures as evidence of the negative social consequences that, in their view, were caused by the cultural shifts of the 60s.
It's really fascinating, how two different groups of historians can look at the same period and come away with such different conclusions. It really shows how history is so much about perspective.
It totally is. And honestly, I think both the progressive and the conservative perspectives offer valuable insights. Neither one tells the whole story on its own.
Yeah.
But by looking at both of them, by considering both sides, I think you can start to get a much more complete and nuanced picture of what was going on.
I agree. But it sounds like there are even more ways to interpret the 60s. Our sources mention something called cultural historians. What's their take?
Oh, yeah. Cultural historians, they're interesting. They tend to focus less on, the big political events and more on, those broader social and cultural transformations that were happening. They're interested in things like how everyday life changed. How did people's values and beliefs shift? And, how do those shifts continue to influence us today? What's that lasting impact?
So they're looking at the 60s, beyond the headlines. They're looking at how those cultural innovations like music, fashion, art, literature, how all that stuff shaped the way people thought and lived their lives.
Wow. Exactly. And they might argue that even if those big political movements, didn't always achieve all of their goals, they still had a lasting impact on our culture. It's like they left behind this cultural DNA that's still part of us today.
That's a great way to put it. It's like the 60s weren't just a decade. They were like this cultural earthquake, and we're still feeling the aftershocks.
I like that, the aftershocks. And then finally, we've got historians who approach the 60s through this thing called social movement theory.
Okay, what's that all about?
Well, they're less interested in, those grand narratives and more focused on the actual mechanics of how social movements work, what makes them tick.
So they're taking a more, I don't know, maybe scientific approach to studying these movements.
Yeah, kind of. They're interested in questions like, how do these movements emerge in the first place? How do they mobilize people? How do they get their message out there?
Yeah.
And how do they actually interact with the political system to try to create change?
It's like they're trying to understand, like, the inner workings of a machine. You know, like, what are the gears? What are the levers that make these movements successful?
That's a great way to think about it. And by studying the 60s through this lens, looking at the nuts and bolts of how those movements operated, we can learn a lot about what makes social movements succeed or fail, and how they ultimately end up shaping history.
So, wow, that's a lot to think about. We've got like 4 different lenses here: progressive, conservative, cultural, and this social movement theory. It's kind of overwhelming, but I think what's really striking is that they all offer something valuable, right?
Right.
Like they all give us a different piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. And it's by understanding these different perspectives, by actually looking at all the evidence and trying to grapple with those contradictions, that we can start to form our own conclusions about what this era really meant.
Well, listener, I think that's a perfect note to wrap up our deep dive on the 1960s. Hopefully we've given you plenty to think about. It was a decade of immense change, a time when America was really trying to reinvent itself, grappling with all these huge issues of race, gender, war, poverty. And even though we're still debating its legacy, one thing is for sure: the 60s were a turning point, and they continue to shape our world today.
I couldn't agree more. And hopefully this deep dive has kind of inspired you to keep exploring this era, keep digging into those sources, and maybe, come to your own conclusions about what the 60s mean to you.
Absolutely. Because history, well, it's not just about the past. It's about understanding our present and, using those insights to build a better future. And the lessons we can learn from the 60s, they're just as relevant today as they were back then. So keep asking those questions, listener. Keep challenging those assumptions. Keep exploring. Because the more we understand our history, the better equipped we are to face the challenges and seize the opportunities of our own time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.